I'm Jacques Beltran, and I work for Dassault System as Vice President in charge of the public sector.
And you formerly worked in the public sector. Tell us a little bit about that role, which was pretty recent.
Yeah, I actually had two roles in the public sector. One about 10 years ago, which was at the Ministry of Transport in France as an advisor to the Minister for International Affairs. So that was the first experience in government. And then most recently, I was working for the Paris region local authority, where I was in charge of European funds, international cooperation, and tourism.
One topic I wanted to cover was how government at all levels, and you have said this, is seeking and implementing innovative digital solutions to meet the needs of public service delivery quickly and safely, especially in this era that we're in right now. So as you talk with cities in your role at Dassault, what are you hearing are the biggest needs amidst this crisis for cities?
Well, I think you're right to say that the crisis has been sort of an accelerator in terms of bringing the cities and more broadly public authorities to understand that they had no other way than full speed digitalization. Because they, specifically with the COVID, I think they were all confronted with a new situation where the data was somewhere available, but they didn't really have the tools to understand what was happening. Many local authorities, local politicians in France, or national politicians, were actually saying, but I know it was like that throughout the world, that they were lagging something like 1 month or 2 months behind the reality of what was actually happening on their own territories. And beyond the understanding of the COVID pandemic, there was also the idea that possibly digital solutions that, by the way, have been implemented in the private sector for years already, could be beneficial to the public sector also. For example, to better manage supply chains that were completely disrupted because of the crisis. At the beginning of the crisis, there were no masks in France and in many countries. Countries were lacking ventilators, they were lacking simple hydroalcoholic solutions. And today it is the vaccine issue. How do you organize, plan, secure a vaccination campaign at the scale of the whole world? All these are nightmares if you don't have the right digital solutions that can help you do it.
Are there some digital solutions that you're seeing and being implemented in France that are working to combat COVID, but also to scale up the vaccine distribution that you think is a good lesson for the rest of the world?
Well, we did two different things at Dassault System that I would like to share with you just to illustrate and to answer your question. And they actually are both deriving solutions that we developed in the industry and applying them to the public sector. So I think it's really interesting. The first one I have in mind is the Philharmonie de Paris, which is the main concert hall in Paris. A very brand new modern concert hall. And they called us because they had heard that we had been working on COVID propagation, airborne propagation in hospitals. And they said, could you come and tell us if you can do something about our concert hall? And in fact, what we did for them is do a virtual twin of the concert hall, both the room and the ventilation system. And then we integrated into the model spectators that would actually cough and simulate what happens in terms of virus propagation, depending on whether the spectator is wearing a mask or no mask, or just a loose mask, and also depending on the ventilation flow. And one of the lessons that we learned was that, in fact, in this specific concert hall of La Philharmonie de Paris, it made more sense to reduce the ventilation by 50% rather than to increase the ventilation, just because the airflow was such that if you reduce the ventilation by 50%, you concentrate the air in areas where there are no spectators. So that was really extremely interesting for the people responsible of that concert hall, because in a sense, our modeling and simulation solutions that actually came from airflow simulation from the aeronautic industry were being used in a cultural space from the public sector. and it helped them adopt basically mitigation actions to reduce the risk of propagation. So I don't think anybody before would have thought of using that kind of solution in that kind of space if we didn't have the COVID crisis. So the COVID crisis sort of accelerating also the development of the market for us, and for all the people who could benefit from it. This is the first example. And then we had a second one that is at a much larger scale, which is one of the regions in France. There are 12 regions in France, and one around the city of Strasbourg, which is today something like 6 million people live in that region. And there are a couple of major cities. And the president of that region, Jean Rotner, said to us what I was saying to you just before, that he was lagging behind in terms of actual understanding of the COVID pandemic. And he said, I know the Ministry of Health, the National Ministry of Health, has the data of what is happening, how many positive cases we have on the territory. Can you help me understand what's happening in my region? So we built for him, using our 3D experience platform, which is our digital platform, our data analytics solutions, our 3D city and territory solutions also, mixing different solutions basically. We built for him a map of his region where he can actually on a day-to-day basis visualize the speed at which the virus is spreading. And we also integrated into that cockpit predictive algorithms, predictive model that is now enable the people from Région Grand Est, the authorities, to anticipate 30 days ahead what is actually going to happen in the public hospitals. How many people will be in intensive care units in 30 days, given the current rate of spreading of the virus. So this is an extremely powerful tool for a local authority to actually take back control of the situation, anticipate what's happening, and make sure that the policies that they are implementing are actually more efficient. And what is interesting is that these cockpits, so we have now 2 regions in France that are using this cockpit. The other one is Région Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, around the city of Lyon. And we're hoping that other regions, maybe in Germany and Luxembourg, could also get hold of that. But what is interesting is that these public authorities are now beginning to think that if they use a cockpit like this in a crisis situation for COVID, they could also use similar tools for other cases. You could imagine that local authorities or cities or even national governments could use cockpits like that to plan renovation of infrastructure, to plan a schooling capacity, to reinforce the efficiency of their transportation network. So, because they have the data, it's just that it is siloed and they're not using it as a very strategic information.
And do you think it could be used, for instance, to model the return to work and the anticipated congestion if we think it's going to get worse on the roads, for instance?
Actually, we used our own company as a test in that situation. We managed the lockdown and the lifting of the lockdown to plan the return on site of all Dassault Systèmes employees. We used our own solutions, Dassault Systèmes Quintic, that's the name of the software, that actually comes from the industry there also, to plan logistics in the industry or human resource planning. And we used it in a new context for us. And it worked in an incredible manner because we were able to plan depending on who lives where and what are maybe the family constraints that they may have, etc. We were able to plan both the lockdown and the lifting of the lockdown in a very, very smooth way. So of course, we could actually use those technologies also, as I said, for planning of vaccination or just planning of a resource, whatever the resource is.
It sounds like successful digital twin implementation is also driven by a collection of data from multiple sources and collaboration between multiple agencies and departments. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys ensure a smooth user adoption across multiple agencies, and also how do you ensure long-term maintenance of digital technology and assets to really realize the potential of a digital twin?
Yes, and thank you for that question. I think you're really touching on the pain point of what digital transformation is about. Um, Public administration are not different than the private sector in that sense. The most difficult thing to do for a public administration that wants to go through digital transformation is to collect and get hold of the data, because like in every organization there are silos, and sometimes they're sitting on the data that they don't even know that the data is there. So as soon as you get hold of that data and that you realize its value, then you can integrate it into, in our case, a 3D experience platform, for example, in this platform. And that's when the collaboration can actually start. And the power of digital platforms like the 3D experience platform is that it immediately brings everybody in an organization to collaborate just because they want to see, understand the data. And entering the 3D experience platform is already the beginning of a transformation of an organization. If we're talking about a city, and if you do a digital twin of a city, of course we are going to do a 3D model, 3D visualization of the city. But the most interesting is the data that you're going to put in the 3D model and how people are going to be capable of using it. The same way we use our platform and modeling and simulation tools to help companies like Airbus or Boeing engineer, design, build aircraft, you can do exactly the same for the cities, and bringing people who generally work in very different departments to work together.
Tell me about what that looked like maybe in Eastern France. You worked with was it a regional authority, one regional authority with multiple departments underneath, or was it multiple authorities? There's a lot of our audience who are really interested in regional collaboration models, and how do you do that? Because we have so many political boundaries that keep data from moving to the right people to do the right things and implement quickly.
Yeah, and this is where you need a strong political momentum. You need some energy at the very high level of the authority to say, look, we want to change the way we're doing things. In the case of Région Grand Est that you mentioned, it is the president of the region who actually really wanted that tool. And basically this cockpit, he decided to give access to a number of his colleagues at the region level, but he's also associating to that other institutions like a hospital, major hospital in Strasbourg, in the capital of this region, that is interested in having access to that data. So just by giving access to the platform, he is creating new connections between people who are, as you said, belong to very different departments. But it can be also the case at a very operational level. I'll give you an example. Dassault Systèmes has built a digital twin of the city of Singapore, working with various agencies in Singapore, the National Research Foundation, the Singapore Land Authority, GovTech, different departments within the government of Singapore. And one of the use cases that we did with them was to see how they could use this model to decide and build a new cycling path in the city. Well, just this very simple example, it sounds very simple, in fact, involves very different departments within Singapore. The people in charge, of course, of the road, of the traffic safety, but also of the trees, because if you're going to build a new cycling path, you have to decide whether or not you're going to cut a tree. And in Singapore, they're very serious about that, and rightfully so. Yeah. You're gonna make sure that the cycling path is useful for students that go to school. So I've already mentioned 4 or 5 different departments within the Singapore organization. And so something that sounds like a very simple infrastructure project, building a cycling path, actually from a decision point of view is complex. And a digital twin of the city is going to accelerate and reinforce the efficiency of the decision-making process. I generally tend to say that city digital twins, they have 3 main objectives, goals. They enable public authorities to measure the impact of what they're doing. For example, if they're spending some budget on energy renovation, they may want to visualize on a 3D model where exactly they are spending their money and how efficient it is for the energy renovation of buildings, for example. So this is measuring the impact of what you're doing, first case. Second use case is when you are planning for new infrastructure. The city is planning to build a new cycling path, a new bridge, a new metro, where you can actually simulate not only the infrastructure, but the impact of that infrastructure. For example, in terms of noise pollution. What is going to happen if you build a new bridge next to housing? Well, we can simulate the noise, the traffic noise that is going to result of this new infrastructure without having actually started to build anything. You're in the virtual world to actually think and improve the real world. And you do that, it's nearly free of charge. So this is the second use case. And the third one that is increasingly important for public authorities is using these 3D models and digital twins to plan and to manage crisis. You can simulate floods, for example. This is something we can do. We integrate into our models flood simulations, and then you visualize the impact of the flooding in the city. And you can do some contingency planning. How do you evacuate people? How do you protect buildings with the flooding? And ultimately, you can manage the crisis, either in the case of a flooding or the example I mentioned to you already with the COVID crisis in the Région Grand Est. You actually real-time manage and make decisions, informed decisions, because you have the data in what we call a single source of truth, which is the platform, the cockpit that helps public authorities make decisions.
Yeah, and you touched on this a bit with your flooding example and your future infrastructure example, but a lot of our audience is thinking about resiliency in the face of climate change, and resiliency in the face of a health crisis and an economic crisis. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on building resilience at all levels of government. How do digital twins contribute to building resilient communities? A little bit more on that.
Well, as I mentioned, flooding is an example. It's a crisis example, but it's a way to manage resilience of a city. You can work, as I said, also on energy renovation, for example. So you're basically going to measure and visualize the actual energy performance of the buildings. And then you are going, based on that, you're going to make decisions to where specifically you think it is the most useful to work to improve the energy efficiency of the buildings. You can optimize transportation, public transportation modes in a city. You can calculate very easily what we call isochrones. How long does it, how far can you go in 10 minutes from your house if you're using a car, a bicycle, walking, etc. You can optimize even walking pedestrian paths. Hong Kong, City of Hong Kong has been working with Dassault System because they wanted to optimize. They wanted us to help them optimize the pedestrian paths in Hong Kong. I don't know if you've already been to Hong Kong, but if you're a pedestrian in Hong Kong, sometimes it's a little bit challenging to find your way. You have to walk a lot in a direction, and they wanted, and rightfully so, to significantly improve that. And so they used our solution, which is also a way to improve the resilience of a city, because you want people to walk rather than use their car, etc. So definitely 3D, what we call 3D city solution from Dassault Systems, but in general, these kind of cockpits are perfectly suited to help public authorities reach their sustainability goals. You can measure the impact of what they're doing. You can simulate the impact of what you would like to do, and you can react in times of crisis.